All right, welcome to another episode of the Real Returns podcast. I am your host, Andrew Reichert, and I'm joined with my co-host, Dan Croce. Dan, what's happening over
It's
there?
fall in Pittsburgh. It's officially fall. So I've got the vest. I'm chilly. I kind of like it. We'll probably have some stew tonight, something like that. So, yeah, welcome to fall.
You can always tell when it's fall around our office because everybody starts wearing their vest, Dan in particular. So, got to keep that torso warm. Well, I am so excited for our topic today. We are actually going to talk a little bit about impact and how personal values and even personal faith can play into the real estate investment process. So I'm going to kick it over to Dan, who is good friends and knows our guest today really well. So, Dan, why don't you go ahead and introduce our
Awesome.
guest?
Thank you. So, today we have with us Ben Erskine. And Ben is a guy that I've gotten to know over the last few years as he's become a fund manager. He's a founder and managing partner at a firm called Callis Capital. He's historically had a really successful career in real estate brokerage at JLL, particularly in the industrial sector, but he's recently transitioned his primary career focus to being an asset allocator through their funds at Callis. They're a really unique business because it's a faith-based organization. Everything they do comes out of a Christian worldview and a Christian perspective. So we have them here today to learn a little bit just of how they think about real estate and impact in the world around them as they seek to deploy capital out of the roots of their faith. So, Ben, can you introduce yourself? Tell us a little bit about Callis.
Yeah, absolutely, and grateful and glad to be here with you guys. Appreciate you having me on. It's been fun getting to know you and your organization, Burgo, and I'm just glad to be here. So I, like you said, Dan, I've spent my whole career in real estate. The bulk of that was really in a transactional capacity. I was working in brokerage, advising corporates on their commercial portfolios around the country, and it was really a blessing. It was wonderful, part of a couple of great teams that grew our book of business over the past 15 years. But two things were pulling at me. One, I always knew I wanted to be closer to the principal side of the business. I wasn't totally sure whether that meant investor or developer or asset manager, but knew I wanted to move in that direction. And then the second the second factor was starting to observe a lot of really interesting things that were happening in the way of faith-driven investing, which is a kind of impact investing. It's just driven by those Christian values, as you said, Dan. So those two things worked together. It was really the second that got me off the dime and kind of got me thinking seriously about making a major change to my career path, and what ultimately manifested as Callis Capital. So we are a faith-driven real estate private equity firm. We're investing with operators across the country that share those values and look to employ those values as they manage and operate real estate assets. We're heavily focused on the housing sector for a bunch of reasons that maybe we'll get into, but we are right now we've got a national mandate, but we're pretty heavily focused in the south and southeast geographies, and are just rounding out deployment of our first fund, and excited to have some early successes to point to. So it's been a great journey so far.
Yeah, congratulations on the completion of that first fund. Can you tell us, this is a really unique approach. I've not come across others in the marketplace that invest in the way that you do. So can you just tell us a little bit about the faith-based approach and how that plays out in the marketplace? Does it inform what kind of deals you look at, or what? Just how does your fundamentally faith-driven approach inform the way that you operate as an asset allocator?
Sure. Um, where we start is we just believe real estate is really distinct in its ability to serve as a platform for, what we would call ministry opportunity and care of tenant, care of community, really taking this view that we're here to love and care for each other in addition to honoring God. And so when you think about those really unique attributes of real estate, the places where people live, the places where people gather, we think it's just an incredible opportunity for impact through that lens. And we don't believe that financial performance should come at the expense of our values or that desire to have impact, but rather because of them. It just, it turns out that loving your neighbor really well just so happens to be really good for a real estate plan and a real estate operator. And so as an investor, there are really three things that we're looking to provide. One is capital, of course, but the second and third are encouragement and thought leadership. So we're not only interested in the investments that are kind of seasoned and mature and investable from our standpoint today, but we're also thinking about how we can help others that are called in the same direction, encouraged to kind of operate on that same set of values, how they can improve models that they've been thinking about or maybe have started but haven't really leaned into, and also just planting seeds with groups that are just kind of in the infant days of thinking about how they can more wholly integrate their worldview and their value system into how they run real estate projects. So we see a lot of that as really fueling what we hope to be a deeper and wider pipeline of investable opportunities way are the road. And as someone that, we are one of a few right now. There aren't a ton of groups that as a capital allocator are taking this approach. We're a pretty good knowledge center. So we're seeing what groups are doing out there around the country and then able to make connections, operator to operator, manager to manager, even vendor to vendor, sometimes not-for-profit to not-for-profit, to prevent this siloed nature and hopefully learn together, kind of bring some thought leadership to bear across different groups that are doing interesting things around the country.
Wow. Yeah, it's a very unique position and a very, it strikes me as incredibly unique because we haven't come across others that take a similar approach. So we do talk, though, frequently, especially given the nature of our focus here on the podcast with people who want to think uniquely and intentionally about impact and real estate and capital and doing things with real estate investing for more than just the bottom line. So with your approach, how do you guys think about impact? What is the end goal that you seek to have? What does success look like in your mission?
So when we think about impact, I think I can break it down in just to the types of care that we generally think about, those being physical, practical, social, emotional, and spiritual care. And that care gets applied in the direction of a bunch of different stakeholder groups, but generally, and I think we're kind of aligned with Burgo on this, which I didn't realize until we were comparing notes, but we think about tenants, communities, investors, managers, and vendors as the five big stakeholder groups that we're in community with and have the ability to care for really well. So that's one type of impact. That's kind of the starting point and the practice element of it. And then the other part for us is, as Christians, is we love the ability to share our why. What's the reasoning behind this? Why are you approaching business this way and real estate operations this way? And that's a fantastic opportunity for us just to share about what drives us.
Yeah. That's interesting, Ben, and I appreciate your kind of heart for sharing your why and how that ties back to some of your worldview and faith. I've got to assume that comes with some challenges. So I'm curious just to hear, what are some of the challenges that you run into as an organization just because of your commitment to having faith and that worldview wrapped into how you operate?
Yes, one of the big challenges is really how do we measure what we're doing, and how do we stay accountable to it? And I think that that's not totally unique to us. When I think about impact investors and what some groups are doing, and the different kinds of impact that they're focused on, I know it's not a totally unique problem, but we think a lot about what we can measure and how we can endeavor to stay intentional and ultimately accountable to the impact that we're seeking to have. And it's just a challenge. It's a challenge to figure out what those metrics are. I mean, it's interesting that across our portfolio, so we're partnered with 9 operators at this point. We've got investments with 9 different operators across the country. And those 9 operators report in on well over at this point, 30 different metrics. So they're thinking about, hey, how are we reaching our tenant base? How are we reaching our community? How are we promoting flourishing? And how do we measure that? There's some things that are a little bit simpler to measure. Things like, hey, how many times have people with the ownership group or the management group sat down and shared a meal with tenants, right? I mean, there's nothing like breaking bread to really make a connection and get to know people. But other things are more complicated. Other things like combating loneliness, which is a real challenge for a lot of people, particularly in apartment buildings. How are we really monitoring the impact that we're having in that direction? That's a real challenge for us. So that's something that we don't think we'll ever land the plane on and kind of have the answer for, but we spend a lot of time, and not just us, Callis, but us with our manager partners out there in the market, talking about and trying to sharpen our ears too.
Yeah, that's helpful, Ben. I like your sort of holistic approach to residents. I'm wondering, what are some of the things that you do to combat loneliness? I can totally see that being a pervasive issue among people, particularly just post-pandemic, apartment building residents. So what are you doing to combat that?
Yeah, I mean, it's almost easiest just to kind of tell a story and give an example. There's a group that we're partnered with that is focused on refugee and immigrant housing. And so you think about, gosh, if anyone might be prone to isolation or loneliness or even confusion, they might not even speak English when they first arrive. And so this group is really, really focused on bringing community members into the apartment buildings that they control to help those groups that are freshly arriving make connections with families, perhaps with children of the same age, to do things as simple as navigate a Western grocery store, right? Things that we take for granted. But if you're coming from the Congo, you may have never walked down the aisle of an Aldi or a Trader Joe's before, right? So something that simple can be very, very overwhelming to the extent that you have partners and friends in the community that will do that with you. It's a huge, huge tool to bring comfort and joy and peace to those families. If you continue to think about examples, even using a stovetop. There are stories with this operator in particular of, gosh, week after week, the smoke alarm keeps going off in the apartment. Why? Well, they've never used a Western stove before, and so the easiest path to cooking dinner is to put the large fish on the open flame, and it's not working out, right? So where's the opportunity in that? Well, can we come in? We'll come into your home, we'll bring some food, we'll share a dinner, we'll show you how to use your kitchen. We can talk about English as a second language. We can talk about financial literacy here in the States. What are you doing to seek employment? I mean, the list goes on and on and on. It's not just loneliness. It can be much broader than that.
Yeah, that makes sense. I know you mentioned you're measuring 30 metrics, and I think a story sort of really helps to understand the impact that you're having. I'm curious about the measurables as well, though. What are some of the key measurables? How are you seeing movement in them? Do you have any statistics that you can share from the early days of your first fund that you've seen some progress in some of the metrics you're tracking?
Yeah, so a lot of them, for us, we tend to see them falling broadly into a couple categories. You can slice it a bunch of different ways, but there's the social impact, which is a lot of what we've talked about, and then there's the spiritual impact. So we're thinking about things like invitation into prayer and being able to pray over people, or invitations to church. We're always seeking those opportunities as well. And in terms of progress, it really comes down to, hey, how are we getting more and more relational? How are we taking what can be a very, very transactional relationship of landlord-tenant and making it much more about community and much more person to person? And the metrics that can be evidence of that are things like, hey, how many, in our complex of 200 units, how many of those tenants did we touch in a personal way this month? How many conversations did we have outside of an invoice? How many live in-person run-ins did we have? How do we open up the door to more of that? What does our on-site team look like? What does property management look like? Are there live-in teams that are tenants and community members, but also a conduit into ownership and property management that can bridge that gap a little bit, right? Hearing something from a neighbor can feel a lot different than hearing it from a landlord, quote unquote. And so I think most of the metrics tie back into this idea of it. If we can be relational first and transactional second, we're doing a better job. And how do we keep moving in that direction?
Ben, I'm curious if, do you have all of your operators tracking the same metrics, or do you cater the metrics to the specific business plan or opportunity that operator is seeking out?
Yeah, they are not all the same. They vary pretty widely, and they're mostly driven by our operators. So as a capital allocator, we want to get behind and be excited about and believe in the mission that they're on, and the underwriting that they're doing, and the real estate, the merits, all of it. But we really want it to be something that they feel called to. So we believe that the best fruit, the best results are going to be born out of something that the operator, the group that's really at the wheel, has passion around. And so they originate with the operators, and therefore, it's not Callis pushing things down, but rather Callis being a sounding board and helping to craft, maybe refine what those metrics and that integration plan might look like. But it's coming from kind of the operator up. So it's very diverse.
Ben, I've got to ask, as you talk about the metrics, you mentioned things like praying for people and invitations to church. I've got to think there's a whole bunch of our listeners and a whole bunch of your residents that would be freaked out by that as something you're tracking and intentional about. And so I'm just curious what you would say to sort of the cynic that might say, hey, Ben, it sounds to me like you're trying to force your religion on your residents. What would you say to folks that feel like this is maybe just a ploy for you to push a separate agenda?
I think I'd start by saying it's rooted back in this relational capacity. So as Christians, we're called to love other people. And so if we can form the foundation of a relationship first on the front end and develop trust and be in community with people, then there's usually a very winsome way that you can address these kinds of things. And it has to be with tact and thoughtfulness. And it can't be a forced agenda. I mean, we don't need to get into a deep theological conversation, but that's just not how it works. It's really kind of a heart issue. But usually there's a lot of reception to a sincere inquiry about someone's worldview or an offer to pray over them. I think people would be surprised at the reception to that and actually joy that can come out of it, even when there might not be an alignment on that worldview, but the fact that a neighbor is willing to kind of go out on a limb and offer up their care and their prayer for you, it's usually pretty well received. But you're not wrong. It's something we have to be very, very thoughtful about. And it is not a forced agenda at all, right? This is about community and care, and where that's welcome, we're eager to step through that door, but it is not, it's not a requirement of tenants, it's not a requirement of community members, it is not a requirement.
Yeah, thanks. That's helpful.
Ben, you had touched on stakeholders, and I wanted to ask a follow-up question. I think you said you define your stakeholders as investors, tenants, communities, your managers or your operators, and your vendors.
Yes.
And it's similar, but a little bit different to how we tend to think of our primary stakeholders at Burgo. I think we put them in 4 buckets. Similarly, investors and tenants and communities. We are vertically integrated, so we don't have outside operators or managers. We think of our employees as a key stakeholder, who are our team that are out there executing the business for us. But we don't actually talk a lot about vendors internally as key stakeholders, maybe from time to time, but I'd be curious to hear how you think about your interaction with them, and what kinds of vendors are you thinking about as stakeholders. So I don't know if it's something that you think much about, but I'd be curious to hear a little bit more about how you process that.
And there's probably a reason that I think they were the 5th of 5 that I mentioned. So it's much easier to focus on tenants and communities and investors kind of as a starting point. But as we've continued to build the business of Callis, and we've got fund operations partners and vendors, and we inevitably get into conversations, given our identity and what we're built around, about why and how and what does that look like at the ground level. And it's really just been kind of eye-opening that other groups are interested in what's driving that impact, what's the purpose behind it, how do you identify, and we want to step into those conversations and encourage others to kind of follow their own hearts in the direction of impact in the marketplace. I mean, we just look at the opportunity in the market to deliver outsized impact, and I know that I'm preaching to the choir to you guys, but it's just immense. And so to the extent that we can, carve out 5 minutes on a call with our auditor about why we're doing what we're doing, and they get excited about it and might just bring a little bit of a new lens to how they're running their business or how they engage with their next prospect, that's great. I think there's a huge ripple effect beyond kind of the core business that you can have with your broader ecosystem and set of stakeholders. And I think there's absolutely room for conflict between stakeholder groups, and how do you navigate that? I think that there's a quote that a good friend of mine that I'm giving him credit for because I think it's his, but John Coleman at Callis Capital likes to say that all investing is impact investing. It's just a matter of what kind of impact you want to have. So your dollars come with influence, and how you choose to put those dollars to work in the for-profit kind of investment marketplace is going to have an effect and consequence out there in the world. And it's just a matter of how you choose to steward it and where you choose to put it, and what kind of criteria you build around the framework for thinking that you build around those decisions. So we are really fortunate to be in a position where we were born out of this purpose. And this could turn into a very long conversation. I won't let it. But we were born out of this purpose, so we got to define our why and our mission very clearly and tie all of our practices to that. And by virtue of that, there's an element of like self-selection, right? The investors that we're partnered with, the operators that we're partnered with for certain, even the vendors that we're partnered with, have visibility to that. And it's been a pretty easy guidepost to stay true to. So as long as at the end of the day, you know what that true north is, and you have your value system clearly defined, and your team and your investments and your business continues to tag up with it and revolve around it. It's not to say it's easy. It's not to say that conflicts disappear. But if you're all rallying around that same true north, you can navigate it much more readily.
Hey, Ben, I have a question. You mentioned the sort of natural tension that exists between some of your stakeholders. I've got to think part of that is you obviously have this outsized care for residents. And I've got to assume that there's a cost associated with that, no matter what you're doing for those residents, whether it's a person's time or putting dollars into their unit, there's probably a cost associated. The other side, you have investors to whom you have a fiduciary responsibility and, have to provide a good return on investment. So how do you manage that tension? And what would you say to somebody that feels like that should be more of a zero-sum game?
It's a great question, and I hit on this really briefly kind of in the introduction, but we just believe that long term, the longer you push out the horizon, the more true this is, in my opinion. But long term, that our values and loving your neighbor well and pouring into this community is very, very much accretive to the bottom line. As real estate investors, we think about things in terms of asset values and NOI, which is generally our measure of profitability, kind of the private equity world equivalent. It would be EBITDA. And so if you think about all the things that we've discussed in terms of community care and pouring into people and relational first, transactional second, long term, the best thing you can do for an apartment building is to attract and retain tenants well, to excel at that in a way that your competitors don't. And if you're loving on people really, really well, you're going to have an easier time building a fabric of community that keeps people longer, that becomes actually a pipeline for new tenants and is an attractive kind of a beacon for new tenants. And that should drive occupancy up, vacancy down, turnover down, the costs associated with turnover down, which in turn means NOI goes up, and there's value creation as a result of NOI improvement. And so, I'll use the cheesy tagline again. It just so happens that loving your neighbor well turns out to be great for the real estate business. We really believe that. We think that you can excel, really be kind of market rate plus in real estate, not at the expense of our values, but because of them. So if you want to strip it down to kind of a 1 month horizon and say, hey, what did it cost you to go have a meal with those residents this month, or to throw an event where you got people together and are building community, I think that you could strip out a line in a P&L and say, well, it cost you $400 this month, and so that's straight out of your margin. But if you'll take a longer view, which most of us are, of value creation, we believe that they're very, very well aligned.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes sense, Ben. So what I'm hearing is you have to take a longer term perspective for the true ROI on that to make itself known. How do you align your investors with that perspective? Are your funds longer term, or how are you thinking about making sure your investors are taking that long term perspective as well?
We're pretty patient, so we've got a 10-year fund life with the ability to go beyond that if we need to by a little bit. which is pretty patient given that we're predominantly a value add strategy. That's kind of a longer window than most value add operators are looking at. But your question's on point, which is there is a tension there at some point where, you feel the pull of financial harvest, you've done your job, you've created value, you can take chips off the table. But what does perpetuation of the ministry model or the impact model look like if you are exiting the asset? And so that's a tension that we're very, very familiar with and think about often, navigate often, negotiate often. But in terms of the alignment, it's really front end. So the kinds of conversations that we're having with investors on the very front end of our relationships are much like this one. Are kind of digging into, hey, what does the business plan of the underlying operator look like? How is it aligned with our value system? And how, ultimately, if we're going to entrust you, Callis, with capital, how can you explain to me and show me that that's good financial stewardship? It's not only community care driven, but it's also good financial stewardship. So we've got to prove it out. And we believe that, we've got some early success that we've been blessed with to date. We believe that as we go further and further down this line, we'll just have more and more empirical evidence to point to that's in support of that.
Hey, Ben, I'm curious just to get a minute or two from you on how you're thinking about investing in this market. We've got stocks are still going way down, and we've got inflation still soaring. The 10T is a ping pong ball this week. It's down almost a quarter point yesterday.
I heard 30 bips. I couldn't believe it.
Yeah. So it's crazy out there. So how is that impacting the way you guys are looking at the core investment business, or is it slow and steady, stay the course?
So I'm going to say things that you guys know all about already, but first, it's a lot of caution. So we are very cautious with new investments that we're making. It's probably taking us longer to work through diligence and really get comfortable with commitments that we're making. But again, stepping back and looking at the larger picture, fundamentally in the housing sector, we still believe that there's a pretty significant imbalance in supply and demand. And if we even look at over the past 6 or 9 months, as interest rates have moved, cap rates have moved as well. Not nearly as much. It's certainly not hydraulic at this point. But we do believe that there's continued risk of upward pressure on cap rates. But there's been such substantial rent growth, and that's for certain cooling. It wasn't sustainable what was happening over the past couple of years, and we don't believe we do believe it's going to continue to cool down. But the supply and demand imbalance is just so significant that we believe that's a really good bolster for continuing to stay active in the multifamily housing space in particular. And when you look at inflation as a factor that is tied to, but independent in some regards, of interest rates and how real estate has fared historically during persistent inflationary periods. The last time we faced any kind of inflation like this was 40 years ago. It was the late 70s, early 80s. And if you go back and study, which we have, how real estate performed, both public and private real estate relative to the stock market, as an example, it's pretty eye-popping how real estate outperformed. So we do think that if history is any indication of the future, that real estate will be a pretty healthy place to be, certainly relative to the public markets. And we do believe that this inflation is going to be pretty sticky. We don't think it's going to disappear overnight. It's probably going to be around for a while.
Cool. Before I hand it back over to Andrew, just wanted to say thank you so much, Ben. This has been great. How can our listeners learn a little bit more about you or keep up with what Callis is doing?
We've got a website, calliscapital.com, CALLIS capital.com, and are always looking for introductions to groups that are out there doing interesting things, and driven by their faith. So again, that's our distinctive, and always happy to make introductions and follow up on everything we talked about today.
Awesome. Well, yeah, thanks again, Ben. We're going to jump into a few lightning round questions. This is our chance to get to know you beyond just what you do. We want to know a little bit about who you are. So, Ben, what would you say is your biggest win of all time?
Biggest win was just the way we felt affirmed in Fund 1. And so we launched Fund 1 in February of 2020. March is when you're both shaking your heads.
Timing is everything, huh?
So March is when things kind of derailed with COVID, and we just felt really blessed and affirmed by some investors that came alongside us and really believed in what we were doing and the thesis, and supported in that. So I've never felt a win bigger than that one.
Yeah. How big was your Fund 1?
We were about 28 million.
Okay. And you said you're fully deployed on
Just
that
about.
now?
We're getting there. Yeah, very close.
Awesome. Well, congrats on that. All right. Favorite movie?
Top Gun, and gosh, it's hard to say it, but I think Maverick was better than the original, and like there's like some level of blasphemy in that. My dad was a Navy pilot. He was an aviator. He flew off carriers. So this is like near and dear to my heart. It's a family movie. And I don't know, he might not be looking down super happy that I think the second one's better than the first, but
It's so
either
good.
or.
Yeah.
I haven't seen it.
Oh
so
gosh,
don't spoil
Andrew,
it.
you gotta go. You gotta just buy it. You'll watch it that much time.
Awesome. How about what's your favorite food? What do you like to eat?
My wife's shrimp pasta.
What's the sauce on that? Is that like an Alfredo or a marinara?
It's real light. It's I'm not a foodie, so I'd mess it up if I tried to speak to it. But it's not cream based, and it's not marinara. It's more like a little bit oily and real light.
Oh, like a
Yes.
garlic oil, like Parmesan kind of
Okay,
situation.
so you are a foodie.
Yes.
That's wonderful. That's good.
That sounds awesome, especially Italian food. All right, what's like a current growth edge? Where are you growing personally and professionally? What's growing for you these days?
Yep, you guys gave me a sneak peek at some of these lightning round questions. So I was thinking about this, and I think I'd say it's our deal flow. I'm thinking about it through the lens of Callis and the work that we're doing. I think it's our deal flow, and I think it's the way that deal flow comes out of the community, this growing community that we're a part of. It's just very, very relational, and it's provided for some incredible opportunities into deals that are off the beaten path, and maybe otherwise we would not have gotten visibility to, or could not have gotten allocation to. So I think it would be community if I pointed to one thing.
Okay, that's an interesting way to get deal flow. I would think that's probably unique in your industry. Leveraging the community, leveraging people to see deals. So I think that's certainly something unique about you and your company. All right, last question. What's some A+ primo content that you're taking in these days? What do I need to subscribe to? What's the good stuff?
Yeah, it's more a plug in our direction, but the faith-driven investor, faith-driven entrepreneur community, they put out some podcasts that are incredible. Those obviously really resonate with me. I think they're having their annual conference right now. I know they are as we speak. But it's a great podcast for anyone that's interested in kind of what that's all about. I'm a huge fan.
Awesome. Have to check that out. Well, Ben, thank you so much. It's been a lot of fun getting to know you a little bit today. I got to say, one of the things that I'm really taking away from today is the way that you talked about how financial performance should come not at the expense of our values, but rather because of them. I love the way that you frame that, and that loving our neighbor is not just a good thing to do, but also good for real estate values. So I think you made some good points in how you care for and love on your residents, and that's something I'm taking away from today for sure. So thanks again for joining. Thanks to our listeners for listening, and we'll look forward to another episode soon.
Super grateful for you guys, and big fans of everything you're doing at Burgo.
Thanks, man.
Thanks, Ben.